The September dawn painted the sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold as James Mitchell eased his beloved 1965 John Deere tractor out of the weathered barn. The familiar creak of its door echoed across the misty fields, a sound that had been part of his morning ritual for over 4 decades. At 58, James's hands bore the calluses and scars of a lifetime spent working this land, each mark telling its own story of triumph or lesson learned. The tractor, with its meticulously maintained green and yellow paint, wasn't just a piece of machinery, it was a family heirloom. James could still vividly recall the day his father taught him to drive it, his 12-year-old legs barely long enough to reach the pedals. "This isn't just about farming, son," his father had said, adjusting the worn leather seat. "It's about understanding where we come from and where we're headed." The Mitchell farm stretched across 200 acres of prime agricultural land that had been in the family since 1892. The original deed, framed in the farmhouse's study, bore his great-grandfather William Mitchell's signature, a pioneering farmer who transformed untamed prairie into fertile fields. 4 generations had worked this soil, each adding their own chapter to the farm's rich history. 5 years ago, when developers started buying up neighboring farms, James had faced a critical decision. Urban sprawl was creeping closer, and property taxes were rising. Other farmers were selling out, taking the money and retiring to Florida or Arizona. But James saw a different possibility. Through careful research and countless meetings with state officials, he discovered the Heritage Farming Program, an initiative designed to preserve traditional agricultural practices while educating future generations. The application process had been grueling. Every piece of historical equipment had to be documented, every traditional farming method justified. James spent months compiling photographs, maintenance records, and family histories. His daughter, Sarah, with her background in education, had been instrumental in developing the educational component required by the program. Now, the farm had transformed into something even his great-grandfather couldn't have imagined. Twice a month, yellow school buses would rumble down the dirt driveway, bringing children who had never seen wheat growing or felt rich soil between their fingers. Their wide-eyed wonder at seeing the massive barn doors swing open, revealing the carefully preserved farming equipment inside, made every hardship worthwhile. College agriculture students would spend their summers learning techniques that industrial farming had largely abandoned. They'd arrive with their laptops and modern theories, only to discover the timeless wisdom embedded in traditional methods. James took particular pride in teaching them to use the antique grain mill, watching their frustration turn to satisfaction as they mastered skills their great-grandparents would have known by heart. The state lease agreement hung prominently in the farm's office, a testament to the Mitchell family's commitment to preservation and education. It wasn't just a legal document, it was a bridge between past and future, ensuring that traditional farming knowledge wouldn't be lost to time. The partnership had brought unexpected benefits too: grant funding for equipment restoration, support for educational programs, and most importantly, protection from the encroaching development that threatened to swallow other historical farms in the region. As James guided the tractor through the morning mist, the rising sun caught the dew on the wheat fields, turning them into a sea of golden sparkles. These moments, when the world was quiet except for the steady purr of the John Deere's engine, reminded him why he'd fought so hard to preserve this way of life. Little did he know that this peaceful morning would be one of his last before the storm that was about to break over his beloved Heritage farm. The first sign of change came not with blueprints or city council meetings, but with the sound of birds. One morning, the usual chorus of meadowlarks and killdeer was replaced by the mechanical growl of earth movers. James stood at his property line, coffee mug growing cold in his hands, as he watched the machines tear into the Johnson family's former cornfields, land that had once fed 3 generations before being sold to developers. Woodhaven Estates rose from the earth like some alien civilization, its construction crews working with ruthless efficiency. Within months, the pastoral landscape transformed into a maze of concrete foundations and lumber frames. The development's entrance took shape first, a grandiose stone archway with copper letters declaring Woodhaven Estates, luxury living in nature's embrace. The irony of bulldozing farmland to build McMansions under such a slogan wasn't lost on James. Tom Richardson, the developer, was a master of reassurance. At the town hall meeting 6 months ago, he'd worked the room like a seasoned politician, his Italian leather shoes clicking against hardwood as he addressed concerned residents. "We understand the historical significance of this area," he'd said, his smile never wavering. "Woodhaven Estates will complement, not compromise, the existing community." When James raised questions about the development's proximity to his working farm, Richardson had been particularly emphatic. "Mr. Mitchell," he'd said, placing a manicured hand on James's shoulder, "your property is completely grandfathered in. The HOA's jurisdiction won't affect your operations in any way. In fact, we're marketing the adjacent homes as having authentic agricultural views. It's a selling point." But that was before Karen Thompson arrived. She purchased the largest model home, a 4,500 square foot executive estate that looked directly over James's eastern fields. From day one, she'd made her presence known, first through pointed comments at the neighborhood welcome party about updating the area's image, then through increasingly vocal complaints at town meetings about agricultural eyesores. Karen's campaign for HOA president had been calculated and relentless. A former corporate executive who'd retired early, she approached neighborhood politics with the same intensity she'd once applied to hostile takeovers. Her platform centered on community enhancement and property value protection, buzzwords that resonated with Woodhaven's wealthy newcomers who'd pay premium prices for their slice of authentic country living. The day after her election, Karen began her crusade. New HOA guidelines appeared in everyone's mailbox, outlining stricter regulations on everything from mailbox designs to lawn maintenance schedules. Her attention to detail was legendary. She'd even specified acceptable shades of white for exterior paint, complete with paint swatches attached to the guidelines. James had initially dismissed the changes as typical suburban bureaucracy. After all, his farm predated the development by over a century, and the state lease agreement protected his operations. But he couldn't ignore the way Karen's gaze lingered on his equipment when she power-walked past his property, her designer athleisure wear impossibly pristine, her phone constantly recording what she termed violations. The tension reached his daughter Sarah's classroom, too. As a local high school agriculture teacher, she'd overheard her students from Woodhaven discussing their parents' complaints about the farm. "Mom says it's decreasing property values," one girl had mentioned, unknowingly echoing Karen's frequent criticism. Looking back, James would recognize these as warning signs, the calm before a storm that would test not just his rights as a farmer, but the very future of his family's heritage. But for now, he focused on his work, hoping that reason and legal precedent would prevail over the ambitions of an HOA president who had yet to learn the true meaning of rural community life. The first notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, just as the wheat had begun to turn that perfect shade of amber that signaled harvest time was approaching. James discovered it while doing his morning equipment check. A crisp white envelope impaled on his fence post with the precision of a military operation. The Woodhaven Estates HOA letterhead gleamed officially in the early light, its gold-embossed logo catching the sun. Notice of violation. Section 7.3. Equipment and machinery restrictions. The letter began. James had to read it twice, his weathered fingers leaving smudges on the pristine paper. The document cited violations for unsightly and outdated agricultural equipment visible from Woodhaven Estates properties, and demanded removal within 48 hours. His beloved John Deere tractor was specifically mentioned, described as an aesthetic nuisance that diminishes community property values. James actually laughed at first, the sound echoing across his equipment yard. The idea that someone could demand the removal of essential farming equipment from a working farm seemed absurd. He thought about his father's words from years ago, "Sometimes, son, people move to the country without understanding country life." The wisdom of those words had never felt more relevant. But Karen Thompson wasn't finished. 3 days later, a second notice appeared, this time laminated against the morning dew, a clear indication that she expected it to remain visible until her demands were met. The tone had shifted from official to personal, with a handwritten note added in precise cursive. This community has standards, Mr. Mitchell. Your antique farm equipment belongs in a museum, not in view of our residents. Compliance is not optional. What Karen failed to understand, or chose to ignore, was the historical significance of the equipment she was targeting. The John Deere wasn't just any tractor. It was specifically listed in the State Heritage Program's inventory of protected historical farming equipment. Each piece had been meticulously documented, photographed, and registered with the State Agricultural Department. The continued use of traditional equipment wasn't just allowed. It was mandated by his agreement with the state. Sarah, who had inherited her father's passion for agricultural education, but none of his patience for bureaucratic nonsense, suggested they host an emergency educational session. Let's invite the HOA board, she proposed during their weekly planning meeting. Show them exactly what this equipment means to our heritage program. But James knew Karen well enough by now to recognize that education wasn't the issue, control was. The situation escalated when Karen began photographing the farm from the road, her iPhone raised like a weapon as she documented what she termed ongoing violations. She timed her power walks to coincide with equipment maintenance, making sure to capture images of oil changes and routine repairs. Evidence, she called it in posts to the community Facebook group, where she'd begun a campaign about neighborhood beautification. James tried reaching out to Tom Richardson, the developer who'd promised his farm would be protected, but his calls went straight to voicemail. The other HOA board members, when approached individually at the local diner or grocery store, offered sympathetic looks but little support. "You don't understand," one whispered over his coffee. "Karen's connected. Her husband plays golf with half the city council." As harvest season approached, James knew he was running out of time. The wheat wouldn't wait for HOA approval, and every piece of his heritage equipment would be needed for the complex process of traditional harvesting. What he didn't realize was that Karen was also preparing for harvest season, in her own way. The notices on his fence were just the opening moves in a game she intended to win, regardless of the cost to a century-old family farm. The morning it happened started like any other harvest day. James had risen before dawn, the familiar ritual of coffee and equipment checks guiding him through the dark. The first hint of trouble came at 6:17 a.m., when his phone lit up with Sarah's call. Her voice crackled through the speaker, tight with panic. "Dad, someone's taking the tractor. There's a tow truck in the drive." James dropped his coffee mug, barely registering the sound of ceramic shattering against the kitchen floor. He sprinted through the dewy grass, work boots unlaced, heart pounding against his ribs. By the time he reached the equipment yard, all that remained of his beloved John Deere was a set of deep tire tracks and the soft morning earth. The security cameras, installed last spring after a rash of equipment thefts at neighboring farms, had caught everything. The footage showed Karen Thompson arriving at 5:45 a.m., wrapped in a designer windbreaker despite the warm morning air. She moved with military precision, directing a massive flabbed tow truck with imperious waves of her manicured hands. The driver, a burly man in a neon safety vest, looked uncertain as Karen thrust a stack of papers at him. "Ma'am, this is an active farm." His voice carried clearly through the camera's audio. "Are you sure about this?" Karen's response was sharp enough to cut steel. "I have all the necessary documentation right here. This equipment violates multiple HOA codes, and the owner has ignored repeated notices. We're well within our rights to remove it." The driver shrugged, hooking up the tractor with practiced efficiency. The John Deere, which had faithfully worked these fields for over 5 decades, was hauled away like some abandoned junk car. The timestamp on the footage showed the entire operation took less than 20 minutes. James's hands shook as he dialed the local police non-emergency line. The dispatcher's response felt like a punch to the gut. "Sir, this appears to be a civil matter between you and your HOA. We can't intervene without a court order." The impound lot, when he finally tracked it down, hit him with another shock. "Special equipment surcharge," the operator explained, sounding almost apologetic, plus emergency removal fees, administrative processing, and secure storage. The total came to $3,875, more than James's monthly mortgage payment. "That's just for the first day," the operator added. Storage fees accrue daily. Sarah, ever practical, started making calls while James paced the barn like a caged lion. Her first target was the state agricultural department, but it was too early for anyone to be in the office. Next, she tried local news stations. Historic farm equipment stolen during harvest season, she pitched, knowing how to grab attention. Century-old family farm targeted by aggressive HOA. 2 stations promised to send reporters. By mid-morning, Karen's phone had gone straight to voicemail 17 times. The other HOA board members proved equally elusive, though whispers around town suggested an emergency board meeting had been called. One sympathetic neighbor, who worked at the grocery store frequented by Woodhaven residents, reported overhearing Karen boasting about finally bringing that eyesore of a farm into compliance. The theft, James refused to call it anything else, couldn't have come at a worse time. 200 acres of wheat stood ready for harvest, each day of delay risking thousands in potential losses. Weather reports warned of rain by week's end. Without his tractor, generations of careful planning and hard work teetered on the edge of disaster. As the morning wore on, James stood at his property line, staring at the spot where his father had first taught him to drive that tractor. He'd faced droughts, floods, and market crashes, but this felt different. This wasn't nature or economics. This was a deliberate attack on everything his family had built. And for the first time in 40 years of farming, James Mitchell felt truly afraid for his heritage farm's future. By noon, the crisis had snowballed beyond the missing tractor. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, both literal and metaphorical, as James faced the stark reality of his situation. 200 acres of golden wheat swayed in the strengthening wind, each gust a reminder of nature's unforgiving timeline. The weather forecast on his phone showed a massive storm system approaching, threatening to destroy his entire harvest if he couldn't get his crop in within the next 3 days. Sarah's social media campaign had exploded faster than anyone expected. Her initial post, complete with security camera screenshots of Karen directing the tow truck, had been shared over 2,000 times by local farming communities and HOA watchdog groups. The comment section became a battlefield between suburban homeowners defending property values and multi-generation farmers outraged by the attack on agricultural heritage. Local news vans started appearing at the farm's entrance around 2 p.m., their satellite dishes reaching toward the darkening sky like mechanical sunflowers. A young reporter from Channel 4, barely older than Sarah, thrust a microphone toward James as he checked his weather radar app for the 100th time that day. "Mr. Mitchell, how do you respond to the HOA's claims that your equipment violates community standards?" Before James could answer, his phone buzzed. Karen's number finally appeared on his screen after hours of straight-to-voicemail calls. His hands trembled slightly as he answered, putting it on speaker so Sarah could record the conversation, a precaution that felt foreign to his usual trusting nature. Karen's voice dripped with artificial sweetness. "Perhaps this will teach you the importance of maintaining community standards, Mr. Mitchell. Woodhaven Estates has a reputation to uphold. We can't have ancient farm equipment destroying our property values during our first major home showing weekend." "Karen, that tractor is state-protected historical equipment," James replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "You've not only violated state agricultural preservation laws, but you've potentially destroyed an entire season's crop." Her laugh felt like ice water down his spine. "Oh, please. This isn't 1950 anymore. Rent some modern equipment if you must, but that rusty antique won't be returning to spoil our views. The impound fees should help you understand the importance of compliance." The call ended with a decisive click, leaving James and Sarah staring at each other in stunned silence. Outside, the first few raindrops began to fall. The other HOA board members, when finally reached, offered little help. "Karen's very passionate about property values," explained Bill Henderson, the board treasurer, his discomfort evident even over the phone. "Maybe you could store the equipment somewhere less visible or paint it a more acceptable color." The suggestion that he should paint a historically preserved tractor to match suburban aesthetics would have been laughable if the situation weren't so dire. James's costs were mounting by the hour. Impound fees, potential crop loss, and now the quoted prices for emergency modern equipment rental were astronomical, if he could even find any available during peak harvest season. Sarah found him later that evening in the barn, sitting on their great-grandfather's wooden toolbox, holding a photograph of himself at 12, proudly perched on the same tractor Karen had just hauled away. The image captured a moment when farming meant freedom, before suburban sprawl and property values complicated everything. "Dad," Sarah said softly, her laptop glowing with dozens of open tabs about agricultural law and property rights, "I think I found something. The state lease agreement. It has a clause about interference with historical farming operations. This isn't over yet." Thunder rolled overhead as James studied his daughter's determined face, seeing in it the same resilience that had helped his family weather generations of challenges. They hadn't survived a century of farming just to be defeated by an overzealous HOA president. The crisis wasn't just about a tractor anymore. It was about preserving a way of life that was becoming rarer with each passing year. Dr. Maria Rodriguez had just settled into her morning routine at the State Agricultural Department when Sarah's urgent email landed in her inbox. The Heritage Program Coordinator nearly spilled her tea as she read the subject line. "Emergency. Protected historical equipment seized by HOA." Attached were video clips from the security cameras and photographs of the impound notice. She did what? Maria's usual professional composure cracked as she speed-dialed James's number. Her voice carried the weight of a decade spent protecting the state's agricultural heritage. "Mr. Mitchell, that tractor isn't just your property. It's a registered piece of state agricultural history. The documentation we filed clearly establishes it as a protected historical asset." The rapid clicking of Maria's keyboard could be heard through the phone as she forwarded the case details to the department's legal team. "This isn't just harassment anymore," she continued, her voice tight with controlled anger. "It's interference with a state-protected historical asset during critical harvest operations. The penalties for this kind of interference are severe." Within the hour, the department's chief counsel, Richard Blackwood, had assembled an emergency response team. A former farm boy himself who'd worked his way through law school, Blackwood understood both the legal and practical implications of the situation. "Time is of the essence," he declared, reviewing the weather forecasts for the region. "Every hour that tractor sits in impound represents potential crop loss." Cease and desist letters were drafted with military precision, each word carefully chosen to emphasize the gravity of the HOA's overreach. Immediate release of state-protected agricultural equipment, the document demanded, under penalty of significant fines and potential criminal charges for interference with protected historical operations. The letters went out by courier to both the HOA board collectively and Karen Thompson personally. Copies were also sent to the impound lot, the local police department, and the county commissioner's office. The state wasn't just firing a warning shot. They were launching a full legal broadside. Maria's team also discovered something Karen had overlooked in her zealous enforcement of HOA regulations. The original development agreement, filed with the county 5 years earlier, specifically excluded adjacent agricultural properties from HOA jurisdiction. This wasn't just about the tractor anymore. Every notice Karen had posted, every fine she threatened, had been issued without legal authority. The HOA president exceeded her authority the moment she stepped onto your property, Blackwood explained during an emergency conference call. But impounding state-protected equipment, that crosses into criminal territory. She's interfering with both a private farming operation and a state educational program. Sarah, who had been documenting everything meticulously, shared their growing social media support. Agricultural preservation groups across the state had picked up the story. #SaveTheHeritageFarm was trending locally, with thousands of supporters sharing their own stories of suburban encroachment on agricultural land. The pressure mounted as local news coverage expanded to statewide networks. Historic farm equipment seized. State investigators respond ran as the evening headline. Reporters dug into Karen's background, uncovering a history of aggressive HOA enforcement at her previous residence in another state. By late afternoon, the state's response had evolved into a multi-pronged approach. While the legal team handled the immediate crisis of retrieving the tractor, Maria's department began drafting new guidelines to prevent similar incidents at other heritage farms. This case would become a precedent, they realized, as urban development continued to encroach on historical agricultural areas. James stood in his kitchen, watching rain start to fall on his unharvested fields, as Maria delivered the final piece of news. The state attorney general's office is now involved, Mr. Mitchell. They're treating this as a direct challenge to our agricultural preservation laws. Karen Thompson isn't just fighting you anymore. She's fighting the entire state of Missouri. The Woodhaven Estates clubhouse, with its folk's colonial architecture and pretentious columns, had never felt more like a battleground. The emergency meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m., but Karen Thompson had arrived 30 minutes early, fortifying her usual seat at the head of the conference table with stacks of color-coded folders and her signature leather-bound planner. Her confidence lasted exactly 3 minutes into the state attorney's presentation. Richard Blackwood, the state's chief counsel, hadn't bothered with pleasantries. He'd simply opened his briefcase and began laying documents on the polished mahogany table like cards in a high-stakes poker game. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his farm boy drawl carrying an edge of steel, "let's start with your HOA's original zoning agreement with the county." The first document slid across the table. Note paragraph 12, which explicitly excludes all adjacent agricultural properties from HOA jurisdiction. Your authority ends at your development's property line. Another document joined the first. This is the state heritage farm registration, predating your development by 30 years. Karen's perfectly maintained composure began to crack. Her French manicured nails drummed against her designer laptop as Blackwood continued his methodical dismantling of her actions. By impounding operational farming equipment during harvest season, you've potentially violated 3 separate state statutes. He ticked them off on calloused fingers that hadn't forgotten their farming roots. Interference with protected historical assets, disruption of state-sponsored educational programs, and willful impediment of agricultural operations during critical harvest periods. The color drained from Karen's face as Blackwood quoted the potential fines. The minimum penalty for each violation starts at $50,000. Given the willful nature of these actions and the documented crop loss risk, we're looking at maximum penalties. He paused, letting the number hang in the air. That's $150,000 per violation, Mrs. Thompson. Personally. The other HOA board members, seated along the table like reluctant jurors, began to shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Bill Henderson, the treasurer, was frantically scanning the HOA's insurance policy on his tablet, his forehead beading with sweat. Furthermore, Maria Rodriguez added, her voice carrying the authority of the state agricultural department, "Every notice you posted, every fine you threatened, was issued without legal authority. The Mitchell Farm isn't just any property. It's a registered state historical site and educational facility." Karen's attorney, hastily summoned from his country club lunch, attempted to intervene. "Perhaps we could discuss a reasonable compromise." "Reasonable." James spoke for the first time since entering the room. His quiet voice carried decades of farming wisdom and barely contained anger. "My entire wheat crop is at risk. Every hour that tractor sits in impound brings us closer to losing the harvest." "What's reasonable about that?" The rain, which had been threatening all day, finally began to fall, drumming against the clubhouse's expensive windows. Each drop seemed to echo the mounting costs of Karen's actions. Dr. Rodriguez unfolded one final document, satellite imagery showing the advancing storm system. "This isn't just about property values anymore, Mrs. Thompson. Your actions have put an entire harvest at risk, threatened a state educational program, and violated multiple agricultural preservation laws. The state attorney general is prepared to pursue this to the fullest extent of the law." Karen's fortress of folders suddenly seemed like a flimsy defense against the tide of legal consequences bearing down on her. Her carefully maintained world of HOA regulations and property values was crumbling in the face of century-old farming rights and state law. Thunder rolled overhead as she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. What are our options?" The tractor returned to the Mitchell farm as the sun was setting, its green paint gleaming in the aftermath of the storm. The impound lot's fees had mysteriously vanished. administrative oversight. They claimed, though the state attorney's business card visible on the manager's desk told a different story. James ran his weathered hand along the John Deere's familiar frame, checking for damage as Sarah documented its return on video. Karen's resignation letter reached the HOA board the next morning, delivered by her husband, who couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes. The carefully worded document cited personal reasons and unforeseen circumstances, but everyone in Woodhaven Estates knew the truth. Social media had exploded with the story, and Karen's reputation as an HOA enforcer was in shambles. The new HOA board, led by retired Judge Michael Anderson, who actually appreciated the farm's historical significance, worked quickly to repair relations. Together with state officials, they established clear boundary markers and educational signage along the property line. Protected Historical Agricultural Site read the new signs, their official state seals glinting in the sunlight. But James, ever the teacher at heart, saw an opportunity in the chaos. With Sarah's help, he expanded the farm's educational program to include a section on agricultural property rights and the importance of preserving traditional farming practices. The story of the Great Tractor Heist, as local schoolchildren had dubbed it, became a favorite among visitors, though James always told it with a touch of grace, focusing on understanding rather than blame. Sometimes, he'd explain to wide-eyed students, progress isn't about changing everything. Sometimes it's about protecting what works, what matters, what connects us to our roots. The incident sparked broader changes, too. The state agricultural department used the case to strengthen protections for heritage farms across the state. Dr. Rodriguez's team developed new guidelines for developments near historical agricultural sites, ensuring that future HOAs couldn't repeat Karen's mistakes. 3 months after the showdown, on a crisp autumn morning, James noticed a familiar figure at one of the farm's educational days. Karen's teenage daughter, Emma, notebook in hand, genuinely fascinated by the heritage farming demonstrations. She lingered after the other visitors left, approaching James with her mother's determination but none of her arrogance. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, clutching her notebook, "I'm doing my senior project on sustainable agriculture and historical farming methods. Would you be willing to be interviewed?" The request led to an unexpected bridge between old and new. Emma's project, featuring the Mitchell Farm's traditional techniques alongside modern sustainability practices, won first place at the State Science Fair. More importantly, it opened dialogues between the farming community and Woodhaven residents about preservation, progress, and finding common ground. 1 year later, the Mitchell Farm hosted its first Heritage Day Festival, drawing visitors from across the state. The John Deere tractor, now sporting a small plaque detailing its historical significance, took center stage. Karen's former parking spot at the clubhouse had been transformed into a community garden, managed jointly by farm volunteers and Woodhaven residents. Life settled back into its seasonal rhythms, but with subtle changes. The farm's new sign read Mitchell Heritage Farm, preserving yesterday's wisdom for tomorrow's future. Below it, a smaller addition stated, Protected Historical Site, established 1892, and in slightly smaller letters, Equipment and Practices preserved by state law. Just in case any other HOA presidents got any ideas. James often reflected on how close they'd come to losing it all, and how the crisis had ultimately strengthened both the farm and the community. The wheat still rippled in the breeze, the tractor still hummed through its daily work, and a new generation was learning to value the delicate balance between progress and preservation. And if anyone noticed that the new HOA guidelines included a special section on respecting agricultural heritage, well, that was just another seed planted during that tumultuous harvest season, one that would bear fruit for generations to come.